So what was the result of all of this negotiation for 6 months in Paris, and really once the world leaders actually left, the delegations they left behind for months more while they put the finishing touches on other aspects of this world government they were creating? Well, they created a hodgepodge, kaleidoscope of nations that really should never have existed in the first place. In 1980, I came back to New York after 3 years in Eastern Europe. I was based in Belgrade, and I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs, and I predicted Tito was then in power, of course, in Yugoslavia, and I predicted a violent breakup when he left office, and into all the component parts. The editors of Foreign Affairs thought this was such a cockamamie idea, so wide-eyed and wild-eyed and so on. They didn't want to publish it at first. And another piece came in from Milovan Djilas, who was actually a good friend and the godfather of my son. He was a famous Yugoslav dissident and very close contact originally of Tito, who broke it with him. And he had a very similar idea of what would happen. So they ran both of our stories. About 10 years later, I got a call from the publisher of Foreign Affairs who said, we'd like to run your story in an anthology we're doing of some of the more prescient pieces that have run in the past couple of decades. And obviously, not many people then thought that Yugoslavia would ever break apart. But it did, and I could see it coming. And frankly, the people who put it together in the first place should have seen that coming, and they didn't. And the same is true in a host of other parts of the world. In some respects, Yugoslavia should return, and in fact it has returned, to the small collection of microstates that should have been the outcome of the Paris peace talks. And I really do believe we're going to see a similar outcome in Iraq. I see it as partitioned eventually back into 2 or 3 or 4 even, but probably 2 or 3 relatively homogeneous nations. In the north, of course, you have the Kurds in Kurdistan. It's a rich country. There are oil rights there. There's oil there. It's practically a self-governing nation already, in fact, and I suspect that could very well be the first of these countries that would be hived off and become independent. In the south, there's the Shiite territory, which also is imminently able to sustain itself as an independent nation with all of the oil resources. There will probably become closely allied with Iran as well. In the middle, of course, is the most difficult. There's a Sunni nation, Sunni Iran. Doesn't have any rich mineral rights, but it is could be very closely allied with Saudi Arabia, a Sunni country, a very prosperous Sunni country, as we all know, right next door. About 2 years ago, my wife and I traveled extensively through Saudi Arabia for a month. Almost everywhere we went in the country, they all said, we'd love to be able to be in a position where we could help a Sunni nation, a small Sunni nation in the middle of Iraq, prosper and survive and grow, much as, for instance, Dubai next door has prospered, even though its oil is effectively running out. And I do think that can work. Saudis are intent on the hostilities ending in Iraq and some sort of a Sunni nation being created in the middle. So I think that's entirely possible. Look, the Western leaders in 1919, they created a world that they felt they could live in. And it was an interesting world, a world that worked for them. It was a world in their own image. They could control nations in their own image that they could control. A series of large, heterogeneous countries that were weak and dependent on powerful benefactors, namely themselves. They thought that would work very effectively. The reason, if you look at the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, they wanted that for that part of the world. The British did, because they wanted a series of trade routes that they could control that would allow them to communicate very easily with the Raj, with India and Pakistan, the subcontinent, which was the jewel of the British global empire then as it stood. And we're having to deal with the results of those results today. I'm confident that nations ultimately find their way to a government that they deserve and that's right for them, if they're left alone. That can lead to peaceful and stable regimes and prosperity of their people. Certainly it happened in Indochina. Look, we have Vietnam, which is one of the most prosperous nations in Southeast Asia. Until recently, its stock market was the most powerful, as they say, an outsourcing capital of Southeast Asia these days, and its people are doing remarkably well. We have a more quiet and more peaceable Cambodia and Laos today. We're gone. The war is over, and they're learning to live with governments that they've created and that can work very effectively for them. We're 90% towards that route in the Balkans. Of course, a few weeks ago, we created the seventh nation, Kosovo, which I do really believe must survive in some fashion if we're ever going to have real peace in that part of the world. We may be, certainly we've had that, for instance, in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia. Again, two pieces of that Central European region that should never been put together. The Czechs and the Slovaks really were very independent people, and were very conscious of their own identity. That didn't work for the kind of countries that the French and the British wanted to really assemble in those days in 1919. I think we may even be headed in that direction in the Korean Peninsula, an area that they just, the peacemakers dealt with in some scattered detail that, of course, finally has wound up as two independent countries. Hopefully, both that will begin to have some dealings with the West we can all live with. So gradually, the world is shaking off the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. I think Woodrow Wilson was not a very good president. And I'll tell you an interesting story about that. Just as I was finishing the book, I had dinner with a very old friend of mine named Michael Andelman. Michael is a senior professor at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and International Studies, and he's a great advisor to Democratic presidents and national security. There's a very good chance that there's a Democrat the next time around, maybe national security advisor. And we got to talking about Wilson. He said, well, what do you think of Wilson? I said, well, frankly, everything I've read and studied and seen and written, I said, I think he was a terrible president. I said, but what do you think of him? He said, well, he said, it's interesting. He said, historians and political scientists divide right down the middle on Wilson. Half think he was a wonderful president. Half think he was a terrible president. Nobody thinks he was a mediocre president. And I think it depends on how you're looking at Wilson, how you examine him. But at any rate, his legacy was one of misery, really, that was foisted on them by the peacemakers in Paris back in 1919. If we're going to get back to where we were then, we're going to get back to a world where the nations can all determine their own destiny, their own future, and learn to live with themselves and with their neighbors, we have to learn from our mistakes of our past and not repeat them. It's just an ultimate message of shattered peace, and I commend it to you. That's it. So, now,